Well, good morning, Tube for you. The topic I've chosen today is my grandfather. He was awesome. He was my mom's dad, and kind of a rough character. He was a farmer, and he was in World War II, and he only had daughters. My mom was the oldest of all those daughters, and he raised his girls like boys, basically. Made them do all the farm work and made them never shy away from anything, and always making sure that they were tough. But my memories of Grandpa Ralph are, I was the oldest, I guess I still am the oldest of all of the grandchildren, and so I was his first grandson, and lived in Colorado at the time, and going to his house was a long haul. I remember riding in the back of the car, and you know, in those days they didn't have car seats, so I remember being in I don't want to hit the other bike. I remember laying down on the floorboards or laying up in the back of the window, you know, behind the rear seat. I remember my parents told me that there was a few times that they made me get out and run because I would get so rambunctious and stuff in the car. And as a father, I know exactly what they're talking about now with my own kids. I've actually done that with my oldest a few times because of what they did, what they told me. Anyway, back to Grandpa Ralph. Whew, forgot where that clutch grabs. Been riding the other bike. But Grandpa Ralph, like I said, he was a farmer, he was rough, he was in the war. And he would cuss a lot. And in my family, that wasn't something we did. You know, the only time you heard cuss words was when you were watching movies or at school sometimes, or with Grandpa Ralph. But one of the things as I got older, we moved closer, and so I got to go and work on the farm a lot. Oh wait, when I was younger, I guess I was still, we moved closer to him when I was like 5 or 6. But he ended up, I love the cows, I love the animals, I love the horses. I only had one horse at a time when I lived there, but tons of cattle. And before I was born, I guess he was a sheep herder. He had lots of sheep up in the mountains, and he really liked those sheep. But later on, I guess it was more profitable to do cattle, so he did dairy cattle, and he ended up milking them when I was little. He had I actually remember the milking machine. And but he said that I used to sing to the cows. So I'd stand up on the bales of hay and sing to them. Put my hands, you know, cup them around my mouth, and I'd yell and sing as loud as I could for these cows. I'd sing primary songs and stuff that I learned at church and at school. But anyway, as I got older, I got to start working on the farm. And we moved to Tennessee when I was 14. I really missed going and working on the farm and being with my friends out west, and so I talked my parents into letting me ride the Greyhound bus all the way back. And that was back in the late 80s, 88, 89, something like that. But I went all the way back to like on it was at least 2,000 miles. On a Greyhound bus all by myself, 14 years old. No cell phone, you know, none of that stuff. And it was awesome to go work on the farm. And Grandpa had this two-wheel drive Chevy half-ton pickup, two-wheel drive, but it was a stick shift. So I learned how to drive the stick shift on the farm. And I'd go out and get bales of hay and throw it in that truck and, you know, get them out of the field. And ended up getting my muscles a little bit that way. But, you know, picking those bales of hay up, I swore they were they weighed about as much as I did. And I'd try to get them as high as I could on top of that truck. But I think one of the things that Grandpa was proudest of me for is they used to irrigate, or, you know, out west that's what they did. He had this patch of this corn that was dying because it wasn't getting, the irrigation water wasn't getting down where it's supposed to get to. So he hooked up a pump and some sprinklers that he borrowed from his neighbor. And then it was my job to move those pipes and get them down where they were supposed to go, and I had to move them. They were really long. I remember them being like 30 feet long or something. And I had to pick them up and move them about 10, you know, like 10 to 20 feet, and then hook them up again, and just did that all the way down. But Grandpa Ralph, you know, he was always pulling tricks and doing funny stuff. And one time he had me on the back of the tractor, and he'd say, well, sit right there. And I was sitting on the back of some irrigation pipe that would roll off. It was like this big spindle. And I would sit up there, and then they'd say, are you ready? And I'd say, yeah. And then he'd pop the clutch. And then, you know, I'm sitting on this rollable spindle thing, and I would roll back, and I'd fall off the tractor, and he'd laugh. He thought that was so funny. I remember him calling me a knothead all the time. Knothead and a pot licker. Another colorful language. More colorful than I'm willing to share. But he was awesome, you know. He was always laughing. He knew everybody in town. Everybody knew Ralph. Everybody loved him. You know, he was just a wonderful, wonderful human. He was always helping people and doing what he can. And I remember him. We'd travel. I hated it when he drove because he would never look at the road. He would always be looking at the fields, and he'd always be looking at the, you know, cows and stuff. And I remember him saying, "Oh, that field's not doing well. Old Charlie must not be paying his tithing. He must not be giving his stuff to the Lord because his field's doing bad." You know, he'd say stuff like that. I can't imitate him at all. I wish I could. He was hilarious. But he would, I hated when he would drive because he'd always drift off the road, and I would always be like, "Grandpa, just let me drive." And this is before I even had my license. After I got my license, he'd always let me drive. But then when I moved to Vegas and I was in high school and doing a lot of other things, I didn't end up going back and working on the farm as much as I should have. But Grandpa was always, you know, they'd always come to my ball games and different things throughout the year, even though they lived far away. And they always made it a point to visit and send Christmas cards and Christmas stuff. And he would, you know, Grandpa was rough, and you're kind of scared of him at times, but you always knew that he loved you. And you always liked hanging out with him, no matter what he was doing. I used to go and help him inseminate the cows. That was how he ended up doing that, and he'd tell me all kinds of facts of life about cows and other things. But one of the other things that I remember, well, I went to Brazil for a couple years, and when it was time for me to come home, he and before I left, he said, "We're gonna come pick you up," and I was like, "Awesome." So before I came home, he and my grandma flew down there, and we spent some time in Brazil together, a whole week. And they were, looking back, you know, they were used to being comfortable in life, and not gotten there. But they took it in stride. They were great with it. And but that was a real special thing, because it wasn't too long after I got home from Brazil that he passed away. He ended up having a stroke, and well, I was in college after I'd been home from Brazil, and I was going to school about 5 hours south of where he was, so I drove up to see him while he was still in the hospital. And you know, after his stroke, he couldn't talk, and he just wasn't Ralph, you know. He wasn't loud. Every time he'd answer the phone, I'd swear the other person on the other line would jump out of their skin, because he'd go, hello! You know, every time he answered the phone, it was like that. What am I? And just seeing him in that hospital bed like that, you knew that that's who his body was, but his spirit wasn't in there. And one of the biggest regrets I have is that he didn't ever get a chance to meet my wife. He passed away, and then I got engaged and stuff the spring after he passed. But that was, he would have, you know, my kids never got a chance to meet him and things, but I try to talk about him a lot with my kids, because he was just an awesome human being. But I miss Grandpa Ralph. There's some movie characters. I probably ought to have said this at the beginning. If you ever watched Smokey and the Bandit back in the 70s, that sheriff that was always chasing the bandit, that was a whole lot like my Grandpa Ralph. Loud and obnoxious and always wearing those cowboy hats. And just funny as can be. I hope all this got on film. Yeah. So there's another memory down my memory lane with AMAP.